Hello, everyone. I'm Officer Cedric Loxley. Today, I want to tell you about something that happened to me while working as a police officer. I want you to understand something before I get into this. I've been doing this job for over 20 years. I have knocked on doors at 2 in the morning to tell mothers their sons aren't coming home. I have stood at crime scenes that would give most people nightmares for the rest of their lives. I have interviewed killers who looked me right in the eye and lied so smoothly I almost believed them. After all of that, I thought I had seen every variation of tragedy, deception, and human cruelty that this world had to offer. I was wrong. What I'm about to tell you isn't a story about violence, not exactly. It isn't a story about a cold-blooded killer or a dramatic chase. It is a story about a small town, a family, a set of secrets that festered underground for 8 years, and one Tuesday evening when everything I thought I knew about reality cracked right down the middle. It started with a knock on my front door, but to understand that knock, you need to understand what came before it. You need to go back 8 years with me to a cool October morning, to a cemetery on the edge of Harlow Creek, Tennessee, and to a man I genuinely liked and respected, a man named Michael Bennett. I want to tell you about Michael first, not as a case file, as a person. Michael Bennett was 51 years old when he died. He stood about 6 feet tall, had sandy brown hair that had gone mostly gray at the temples, and he had this way of listening to you, really listening, where he'd lean forward slightly and nod just enough to let you know he was catching every word. He wasn't a flashy man. He wore flannels in the winter and plain cotton shirts in the summer. He drove a 10-year-old pickup truck he refused to replace because, as he once told me, the truck still ran fine and he didn't see the point in spending money just to spend it. I had known Michael for about 12 years before his death. We weren't close in the way that some men are close. We didn't fish together on weekends or share drinks at the bar on Friday nights. But Harlow Creek is the kind of town where everyone knows everyone, and over the years, Michael and I had built up the quiet, reliable kind of friendship that forms between two men who simply respect each other. He would wave from his driveway when I drove past. He'd buy me a coffee at Greta's Diner on the rare occasions we ended up there at the same time. He came to my daughter's school play 3 years running because his own kids were in it. That kind of friendship. The kind that doesn't announce itself but is real nonetheless. Michael owned a modest lumber and hardware supply business called Bennett Building Supply, which his father had started back in the 1970s. By the time Michael was running it, the business employed about 18 people and served most of the contractors and home builders in a 30-mile radius. He wasn't rich, but he was comfortable, and more importantly, he was the kind of businessman people trusted. I never once heard anyone in Harlow Creek say a genuinely bad word about Michael Bennett, and in a town this small where gossip travels faster than weather, that is saying something. He had a family that he was clearly devoted to. His wife Patricia, Pat, everyone called her, was a quietly determined woman who taught 4th grade at Harlow Creek Elementary for almost 20 years. They had 2 children, Ethan, who was 19 at the time of Michael's death and already working part-time at the hardware store, and Claire, who was 16 and had just started her junior year of high school. Michael also had a brother named Richard, 3 years older, who lived about 40 miles away in the town of Millhaven and ran a small auto repair shop. And he had a sister named Susan Miller, who lived in Nashville with her husband and came back to Harlow Creek for holidays. There was another person in Michael's orbit who I should mention now, because his presence will matter later. Thomas Green. Thomas was Michael's business partner. They had entered the partnership about 7 years before Michael's supposed death, when Michael was looking to expand the company and Thomas brought capital and connections in the regional construction industry. Thomas was 47 years old, stocky, with a sharp business mind and a way of working a room that was charming without being entirely trustworthy. I never had any specific reason to distrust Thomas Green, but there was something about him that kept him at the edge of my awareness rather than the center of it, the way certain people occupy space without fully landing. Thomas was a bachelor. He had been married twice, first to a woman named Donna Parrish, who had moved to Georgia after the divorce, and then briefly to a woman named Lynn Carpenter, who had left him after about 18 months and relocated to Chattanooga. He had no children from either marriage. He had a brother in Arizona named Norman, whom he almost never mentioned and who, as far as I could tell, barely featured in his life. He rented a house on Creekside Road, drove a late-model SUV, and was regarded in town as a successful businessman who kept to himself in personal matters. None of that seemed important at the time. So when Michael Bennett died of an apparent heart attack on a Wednesday afternoon in October, 8 years ago, the grief that settled over Harlow Creek was the genuine kind. the kind that comes when a town loses a man who actually mattered to it. I got the call from dispatch at around 5 in the evening. A woman, Patricia, had called 911 after finding her husband unresponsive on the back porch of their home on Birchwood Lane. By the time I arrived, the paramedics were already there. They had been working on him for several minutes. The lead paramedic, a young man named Danny Orr, looked up at me when I came through the gate and shook his head. I remember the light that evening, this thin, pale October light that made everything look like it was already fading. The initial assessment was cardiac event. Michael had been sitting in his deck chair with a glass of iced tea on the table beside him. No signs of struggle. No obvious trauma. Patricia had been inside grading papers when it happened. She came out to call him for dinner and found him slumped to one side, gone. I spoke with Patricia that evening while the paramedics completed their work. She was in shock, the controlled, almost eerily quiet kind of shock that some people fall into before the reality of a loss crashes over them. She answered my questions carefully. She said Michael had been complaining of fatigue for several weeks. He had an appointment with his doctor scheduled for the following month, but had not yet gone. She said he had seemed unusually tired that afternoon when he came home from the store. She said she had kissed him on the cheek and told him to sit down and rest. Those were the last words she spoke to her husband. She told me that, and her voice didn't crack when she said it. It would crack later, I knew, but not then. I stayed at the house until nearly 9 that evening. I spoke with Ethan, who had been at a friend's house and arrived home to find his mother being consoled by neighbors. He was white-faced and silent in the way that young men are when grief is so large they simply can't hold it yet. I tried to say something useful to him. I don't think anything I said was adequate. The case was treated as a natural death from the beginning. The county medical examiner, a man named Dr. Arthur Prewitt, who has since retired, performed the examination and confirmed the preliminary conclusion. Cause of death: acute myocardial infarction. Michael had an undetected coronary artery blockage. It was the kind of thing that can take a man without warning. Dr. Prewitt had been doing this work for over 2 decades, and there was nothing in his examination that raised any concern. A few of the details from those early hours are worth noting now, even though I couldn't have known their significance at the time. The body had been found in an outdoor setting in October, which meant it had been exposed to cool temperatures for some hours. Dr. Prewitt had noted this in his report, and it had been used to explain certain minor anomalies in the examination findings. I accepted that explanation without question. So did everyone else. Prewitt was a credentialed professional doing an official function, and there was simply no reason to look harder at his conclusions. The identification of the body was based on visual recognition by Patricia, by Ethan, and by the first responders, all of whom knew Michael and confirmed it was him. There was no formal fingerprint comparison conducted because, in a case of presumed natural death, with family present to visually ID the deceased, that level of additional verification was not standard protocol. That gap, that specific procedural gap, was the door through which the entire deception walked. The funeral was held 8 days after Michael's death, on a Thursday morning with a light rain coming down. The First Baptist Church was standing room only. I sat 3 rows back in my dress uniform because that felt like the right thing to do. I watched Patricia sit in the front row with her children on either side of her. I watched Richard Bennett, Michael's brother, deliver a eulogy that was measured and dignified and clearly cost him a great deal to get through. I watched Susan Miller cry openly into her husband's shoulder. In the pew near the back, I noticed Thomas Green. He was wearing a dark suit, and he had the expression that business partners and colleagues tend to wear at these events: sober, respectful, present in a professional, personal way that acknowledges closeness without claiming family-level grief. He caught my eye at one point and nodded. I nodded back. I remember thinking that the death was going to be difficult for the business as well as for the family, and wondering briefly what Thomas would do with the company going forward. I did not think more than that about Thomas Green at the funeral. Then I stood at the graveside on a hill overlooking the town, in that thin October rain, and I watched Michael Bennett's casket being lowered into the ground. I placed a hand on Patricia's arm as people began to disperse. She looked at me and nodded. That was enough. I walked back to my cruiser, drove back to the station, and filed the last of the paperwork. Case closed. Natural death. No investigation required. Life moved on, the way it always does. Patricia remained in Harlow Creek. She kept teaching. She sold the hardware store to Thomas Green, Michael's former business partner, within about 18 months. Ethan stayed local for a few years before eventually moving to Knoxville for work. Claire grew up, graduated high school, went to the University of Tennessee on a partial scholarship, and became a school teacher like her mother. Richard Bennett kept his shop in Mill Haven. Susan came back for holidays. Thomas Green, meanwhile, ran Bennett Building Supply for approximately 2 years, before abruptly announcing that he was leaving the area. He sold the business to a local contractor named Warren Peel, told his neighbors he decided to relocate, and was gone within a month. People remarked on it briefly. A few found it odd. But Thomas had always been a man who kept his private life private, and nobody had a strong enough claim on him to push for an explanation. I would spend a great deal of time, years later, turning that departure over in my mind. But at the time, I barely noted it. I marked the passage of time the way a small-town officer does, through the slow accumulation of ordinary calls, minor disputes, fender benders, domestic situations, and the occasional serious case that reminded me why the work mattered. I thought of Michael once in a while, the way you think of people whose absence has become a normal part of the landscape. I did not think about Michael Bennett again in any significant way until the evening of March 14th, 8 years after his funeral, when someone knocked on my front door. It was a Tuesday. I had been off duty since 4 o'clock. My wife, Donna, was visiting her sister in Memphis for the week, so I was alone in the house. I had eaten a bowl of leftover chili, watched about 40 minutes of a documentary about the Tennessee Valley, and was considering going to bed early when the knock came. It was just past 9 o'clock. I wasn't expecting anyone. I am a police officer, so I don't answer my front door at 9 at night the way a civilian might. I went to the door with my hand near my sidearm. Old habit. I looked through the peephole. There was a man standing on my porch under the yellow porch light. He was tall, gray-templed, wearing a plain flannel jacket. He was looking down at his shoes, not at the door, the way a person does when they've worked up the nerve to knock and are now waiting, half hoping no one answers. I knew the shape of that face before I consciously registered what I was seeing. I stood very still on my side of that door for what I believe was about 15 seconds. My brain was performing some kind of emergency audit, running the image through every catalog of memory it possessed, refusing to accept the conclusion it kept arriving at. I opened the door. The man on my porch looked up. It was Michael Bennett. Not a man who resembled Michael Bennett. Not a relative I hadn't met, or a stranger with a similar build. It was Michael Bennett, 8 years older, which put him now at 59. His hair had gone fully gray. He had lost some weight, and his face had new lines in it. The particular lines that come not from ordinary aging, but from sustained hardship, from years spent carrying something heavy. But his eyes were exactly as I remembered them. That steady, direct gaze, the slight forward lean of a man who was genuinely paying attention. He looked at me. I looked at him. Neither of us said anything for a moment. Then Michael Bennett said, in a voice that was just slightly rougher than I remembered, "Hello, Cedric. I know this is going to be hard to believe. I would like to be able to tell you that I handled that moment with the composure of a 20-year law enforcement veteran. I cannot tell you that. What I actually did was take 3 steps backward, hit my kitchen table, grab the edge of it to keep myself upright, and say something profoundly unprofessional that I will not repeat here because this is a family-friendly channel." Michael waited. He stood on my porch and waited, with a patience that somehow made it worse, as though he had rehearsed for this, as though he had known exactly how the person who answered the door would react, and had simply accepted it as part of whatever this was. I regained myself, or I regained enough of myself to function. I told him to come inside. He sat at my kitchen table. I sat across from him. I kept my hand near my sidearm, not because I was afraid of him, but because some part of my nervous system was operating on autopilot, and it did not know what else to do. I said, "Michael." He said, "Yes." I said, "I was at your funeral?" He said quietly, "I know you were." I said, "I watched them put you in the ground." He said, "I know that too." And then he said, "I need your help, Cedric, but I need you to understand something first. I need you to understand that what happened 8 years ago was not my idea, and I have spent the better part of those 8 years trying to find a way to undo it." I stared at him for a long time. Then I picked up my phone and called the station. What followed in the next 72 hours was one of the most chaotic periods in the 30-year history of the Harlow Creek Police Department. I want to be clear about something. I did not bring Michael into the station immediately. I made the call because I needed my supervisor, Chief Donna Hartley, no relation to my wife, aware that something extraordinary had just happened. I was off duty, I was alone, and I was looking at a man who was either exactly who I thought he was, or someone with an extremely good reason to impersonate him, and either way this was going to require more than one set of eyes and ears. Chief Hartley arrived at my house within 20 minutes, along with Detective Sarah Whitman, who had been one of our best investigators for about 6 years at that point. I had worked with Sarah on enough serious cases to trust her judgment, and I was very glad to see her face when she came through my front door. She glanced at Michael, then at me, and her expression did a thing that I imagine my expression had done about 30 minutes earlier. Sarah pulled me aside while Chief Hartley sat with Michael at the table. She said, in a very low voice, "That looks like Michael Bennett." I said, "I know." She said, "Michael Bennett is buried at Harlow Creek Memorial Cemetery." I said, "I know that too." She gave me the look that investigators give each other when the situation has officially left the territory of ordinary and entered somewhere none of their training has taken them. We went back to the table. Michael was calm, unnervingly calm, I would say, except that the calmness didn't feel like indifference. It felt like the calmness of a man who had been carrying a terrible secret for a very long time, and had finally decided the weight was more than he could continue bearing. There was relief underneath the surface of his composure, and exhaustion, and something else I couldn't quite name yet. I would name it later. It was grief. He answered our initial questions simply and without evasion. He confirmed his full name, Michael James Bennett. His date of birth, March 3rd, 1956. His address, as of 8 years ago, 412 Birchwood Lane, Harlow Creek. His wife's name, his children's names, his brother's name, his sister's name, the name of his business, the name of his doctor, the street where he grew up, his mother's maiden name, the high school he attended, and the year he graduated. Details that only Michael Bennett would know, delivered without hesitation or stumbling. Sarah asked him to walk us through where he had been for the last 8 years. He said he would tell us everything, but that he wanted to ask one thing first. He said, "How is Patricia?" There was a silence at the table. Chief Hartley said, "She's doing all right, Michael. She's been managing." He nodded slowly. Then he looked down at his hands for a moment. Then he looked up and said, "Is she still in the house on Birchwood Lane?" Hartley said yes. He nodded again. Then he said, "Don't tell her tonight, please. I know I have no right to ask anything, but I need to be ready for that. And I need you to understand what actually happened before she hears my voice." We agreed to hold off on contacting Patricia until the following morning. It was the strangest agreement I have ever made in my career, but it was the right call given the circumstances. Whatever was happening here was going to detonate like a bomb when it reached the community, and the least we could do was try to manage the blast radius. Sarah and I spent the next 2 hours taking Michael's initial statement while Chief Hartley coordinated with the county to bring in additional support and quietly begin pulling the original case file from 8 years ago. Michael told us the broad outlines that night. I'm going to give you those outlines, but I want to warn you. The full picture took much longer to emerge. What he told us that first night raised more questions than it answered. He said he had not died 8 years ago. He said he had left Harlow Creek under circumstances that he called forced and desperate, and had been living under a different identity in a rural area of western North Carolina. He said the decision to leave had not been entirely voluntary, that he had been given what he described as no real choice, but that he had made choices of his own in the aftermath that he was not proud of. He said the person who was buried in the cemetery on that October morning was not him, and that he did not learn whose body had actually been buried until much later, and under circumstances that had taken him years to process. When he said that someone else was in that grave, Sarah sat back slightly in her chair, and I watched her recalibrate everything she'd been thinking since she walked through my door. I asked him who was in the grave. He said, "That's the part that took me the longest to understand, and it's the part I need you to investigate, not just take my word for. I will tell you what we eventually learned. But not yet, because the story didn't proceed in a straight line. It moved the way investigations always move, which is sideways, backward, in circles, and then suddenly forward in a rush that leaves you breathless. By 7 o'clock the following morning, word had begun to leak. In a town the size of Harlow Creek, containing a secret overnight is essentially impossible. By the time Sarah and I arrived at the station for the 7 a.m. briefing, there were already 2 phone messages from journalists, one local, one from a Knoxville station, and 3 people had already called the front desk to ask if it was true that Michael Bennett had come back from the dead. That phrase, "and come back from the dead," would follow this case for its entire duration, and I want you to understand how much it frustrated me every single time I heard it, because it is exactly the kind of framing that prevents people from thinking clearly about what actually happened. Michael Bennett had not come back from the dead. He had been alive the entire time. The question was not supernatural. It was criminal. Chief Hartley had made the decision early that morning to notify Patricia Bennett before the news spread further. She assigned that task to me, which I accepted with the full understanding that it was the most difficult conversation I had ever been asked to have. I drove to 412 Birchwood Lane at 8 o'clock in the morning. It was a clear day, cold and bright, with the kind of March light that looks cheerful from a distance but has no warmth in it when you actually stand in it. Birchwood Lane was quiet at that hour, a few cars in driveways, a neighbor walking a dog who glanced at my cruiser with the mild curiosity of someone who has never had reason to fear the sight of a police car. It occurred to me as I pulled into the driveway that Patricia's neighbors had no idea what was about to happen to their street's entire sense of itself. Patricia answered the door in her teacher's clothes. She still had a job to get to. She was 54 years old now, and she had worn the years of widowhood in the quiet, dignified way she wore everything. Her hair was a little shorter than I remembered. She had new reading glasses on top of her head. She saw my face and immediately went still. She said, "Cedric, what happened?" It wasn't a question. People who have already had a police officer deliver terrible news to them recognize the face of someone about to do it again. I said, "Pat, can I come inside?" She stepped back without a word. We sat in her living room, which still had the same furniture I remembered from 8 years ago, and I told her. I told her that a man had come to my door the previous night who identified himself as Michael Bennett and who had passed our initial verification questions. I told her we were conducting identity confirmation procedures. I told her we were not certain of anything yet. And then I told her, because she deserved the truth, more than she deserved a managed version of it, that the man had known things, specific, private, detailed things, that were very difficult to explain unless he was who he said he was. Patricia Bennett sat across from me in her living room, in the pale March light, and was absolutely silent for about 45 seconds. Then she said, "Where is he?" I said he was at the station. She said, "Is he all right?" I had expected anger. I had expected disbelief, denial, hysteria even. I had prepared for all of those. What I had not prepared for was the first question being about his welfare. After 8 years, after a funeral, after raising 2 children alone. The first question was whether he was all right. That told me something about Patricia Bennett that I filed away and kept. I told her I needed to ask her to wait, just for a short while, until we completed some of the verification procedures. She understood. She called the school to arrange a substitute, and then she sat in that house, waiting, with a patience that was almost frightening in its composure. The identity verification process began that morning and would continue over the following days. I want to walk you through it because it is important to the story and because it illustrates exactly how complicated the situation actually was. The first layer of confirmation came from fingerprints. Michael Bennett's fingerprints were on file from a voluntary submission he had made years ago as part of a community safety initiative. He had done it alongside his employees as a trust-building exercise when we were running a department-wide ID project. Detective Sarah Whitman personally compared the prints taken from our visitor the previous night with those on file. They matched. That was significant. Fingerprints cannot be faked in any realistic, practical sense. The man sitting in our conference room was Michael James Bennett. But we kept going because the situation demanded absolute certainty, and because we were already aware that questions would be raised by the media, by the family, and by anyone with a reason to contest Michael's identity. We brought in Dr. Calvin Marsh, our department's medical examiner, who took blood samples for DNA processing. DNA would take longer, but we initiated the test immediately. We also contacted Michael's physician of record, a Dr. Sandra Wu, who had taken over the practice from the old family doctor years ago and requested all available medical records. There were dental records on file, which another specialist compared against a dental examination of Michael conducted that morning. Everything matched. By early afternoon on the first day, we had fingerprint confirmation. By late afternoon, dental confirmation. The DNA would confirm within 72 hours. Meanwhile, the secondary waves of this case had begun crashing into each other. The first person to arrive at the station without being summoned was Richard Bennett, Michael's brother. Richard had heard from a cousin who had heard from a neighbor who had heard from the dispatcher's girlfriend. He came through the front door of the station at just after noon, and when I went out to the lobby to meet him, his face was the color of old ash. He said, "Where is he?" I said, "Richard, let's go somewhere quiet." He said, "Where is my brother?" I took him to a small conference room. He sat down heavily in the chair. He was 62 years old now, and he looked every bit of it in that moment. His hands were flat on the table, and he was staring at them. He said, "They told me Michael is here, that he's alive." I said that we were verifying everything, but that yes, we had someone in custody who appeared to be Michael Bennett and who had passed initial identification checks. Richard lifted his eyes to me. There was something in them I couldn't quite read at that moment. Something that went beyond shock, beyond relief, something that looked, at the edges, almost like fear. He said, "Can I see him?" I said I needed to ask him to wait until we had completed some procedures. I said we would need to speak with him in detail about the original events 8 years ago and about Michael's life and history. He agreed. He sat in that conference room for 2 hours, barely moving, until Sarah came in to conduct his formal interview. I watched that interview from the observation side of the glass. Sarah opened with standard questions. His name, his relationship to Michael, how he had heard the news. Richard answered all of that normally. Then she moved into the territory of the original death, and I watched his body language shift. Not dramatically, just slightly. The way a person who has prepared for a conversation can still be caught off guard when it goes in a specific direction. She asked him about the days around Michael's death. He described them the way you would expect. Shock, disbelief, the practical necessity of helping manage Patricia and the children, making arrangements. He said he had identified his brother's body at the funeral home before the burial. He said it had been the hardest thing he had ever done. He said it with such quiet conviction that for a moment I doubted everything. For a moment I thought maybe the man in our conference room was not Michael Bennett at all. Maybe the fingerprints were wrong. Maybe some elaborate con was being played on us by someone I couldn't yet see clearly. Then Sarah asked a simple question. She said, "Richard, when you identified your brother's body at the funeral home, can you describe that for me? The setting, who was with you, what you remember?" Richard paused. It was about 3 seconds of pause, which sounds brief, but is an eternity in a conversation that has been flowing smoothly. Then he described a scene that was detailed and specific and internally consistent. But when Sarah later pulled the funeral home records, a particular detail he mentioned did not match. A small thing. The location of a specific room. The kind of detail a grieving brother might misremember. Or the kind of detail that becomes unreliable when you're constructing a memory rather than recalling one. I noted that. I noted it carefully. Sarah asked him at the end of the interview whether he had any thoughts about who the man in their conference room might be, if not Michael. She watched his face as she asked it. He said, "It has to be Michael. Who else could it be?" The way he said it, "Who else could it be?" landed strangely. Not wrong exactly, but strange. Like a man who knows the answer to a question but needs to appear to be asking it. I let it sit. We were not ready to confront Richard with anything yet. We didn't have enough. The second significant arrival that day was Emily Ross. Emily was an investigative journalist based in Knoxville who had a particular interest in small-town cases and community stories. She was 38 years old, sharp-eyed, direct, and had a history of breaking stories that local authorities would have preferred to break themselves. She arrived in Harlow Creek by early afternoon with a notebook and a recording device and the particular expression of a person who knows they are standing at the edge of a major story. I did not speak with her that day, but I logged her presence because I have learned over the years that investigative journalists sometimes know things before we do, and sometimes those things matter. The third arrival was David Carter. David Carter was the family attorney who had handled Michael's estate 8 years ago. He was now 61, still in private practice in Harlow Creek, and he arrived at the station at 3 in the afternoon and asked to speak with whoever was leading the investigation. He was shown to Chief Hartley's office. I sat in on that meeting at the chief's request. Carter was professional and measured. He said he had been Patricia Bennett's attorney as well as the estate attorney for Michael's affairs. He said he needed to understand the legal landscape here, what it meant for Michael's estate, for the death certificate, for the probate proceedings that had concluded 7 years ago. Chief Hartley told him we were in the early stages of confirming identity and that legal questions would have to wait. Carter nodded. Then he said something that I found interesting. He said, "I want to note for the record that whatever we learn about where Michael has been, and whatever we learn about the circumstances of his disappearance, there are people in this community who have made significant financial decisions based on the legal fact of his death. I'm not saying anything improper occurred. I'm saying that there are going to be complications, and I want to be positioned to protect my clients appropriately." I asked him directly which clients he meant. He said, "Patricia, primarily, and Ethan." I noted that he didn't mention Claire. He may have simply been listing the clients he had current active relationships with, or it may have meant something. I did not know yet, but I wrote it down in my notebook when I left the room, and I kept thinking about it over the next several days. There was one more person I want to tell you about from that first day. Someone who didn't come to the station and didn't make any dramatic appearance, but whose absence was itself a kind of presence. When we ran the name Thomas Green through our records as part of our parallel inquiry into the original case, we found something that should have surfaced years earlier and hadn't because nobody had any reason to look for it. Thomas Green had never officially relocated anywhere. He had no new address filed with the state. He had not renewed his driver's license. He had filed no tax returns after the year of Michael's supposed death, a gap that had been flagged at some point by the IRS and then languished in bureaucratic follow-up because Thomas had no immediate family making inquiries and the amounts in question were modest enough that the case had simply drifted. Thomas Green had vanished from the official record the same autumn that Michael Bennett had died. That symmetry was not a coincidence, and now that I was looking for it, it was extraordinary that nobody had connected those two disappearances before. The answer, of course, was that they hadn't been seen as two disappearances. Michael had died, documented and certified. Thomas had simply moved on. People move on. People leave small towns. It is unremarkable, unless it isn't. Patricia's meeting with Michael happened that evening, at just past 6 o'clock. I will not describe it in full, because some of it was private in a way that even the passage of time and the public nature of what followed don't entirely strip away, but I will tell you what I observed. They were brought together in a secure room at the station. I watched through the glass with Chief Hartley. Sarah was in the room, positioned near the door, present but giving them space. Patricia walked in first. She stood near the far wall, her arms at her sides, her face controlled in that way she had. Then Michael was brought in. He saw her. He stopped walking. He just stopped in the middle of the room and looked at her, and something in his face broke open in a way that nothing else had broken since he came to my door. He had been remarkably composed through the fingerprinting, the dental examination, the questions, the waiting. He broke at the sight of his wife. Patricia looked at him for a long time. Then she crossed the room, stopped about 3 feet from him, and said in a very quiet voice, "Tell me everything." And that was all she said to him for the first hour. Everything else was him talking and her listening, and that expression on her face that I couldn't name from behind the glass, that expression that lived somewhere between love and devastation and fury and relief, all tangled together into something that human beings don't have a single word for. I will tell you what Michael told her and what he told us in the formal interviews over the following days, because it is the spine of the story and everything else connects to it. 8 years ago, in the weeks before his supposed death, Michael Bennett had discovered something about his business that he was not meant to discover. His business partner, Thomas Green, had been systematically defrauding the company for approximately 4 years. The nature of the fraud was specific and, in retrospect, elegant in a terrible way. Thomas had been running a parallel supply chain, redirecting a portion of the business's contracts through a shell company he controlled, billing the clients at the official Bennett building supply rates, collecting the payments himself, and recording false invoices in the company's books to account for the gap. He had been doing this carefully, incrementally, in amounts that were large enough to matter, but small enough to stay beneath the threshold where an obvious audit would have caught them quickly. By the time Michael found out, through a supplier invoice that didn't match what was in the accounts, a tiny discrepancy that he almost missed, Thomas had diverted somewhere in the region of $300,000 over those 4 years. Michael confronted Thomas. And Thomas, Michael told us, did not apologize. He did not deny it. He made Michael an offer. He said that if Michael went to the police, Thomas would go to prison, but he would also ensure that certain other information became public. Information about Michael that Michael had believed was buried forever. Information about a financial irregularity that Michael himself had committed years before the partnership, involving a short-term business loan and some misdirected funds that technically constituted fraud. Even if Michael had long since quietly repaid everything, it was the kind of thing that might or might not result in prosecution after so many years, but it would certainly destroy Michael's reputation, his business, and his family's sense of who he was. Thomas had known about it. He had apparently known about it for years and had been sitting on it like an insurance policy. Michael was trapped, and he was ashamed in a way that is particular to people who have spent their lives building a reputation for integrity and who are suddenly confronted with the moment when their own choices from the past expose the gap between who they believed themselves to be and who they actually were. That shame, he told us, was part of why he didn't tell Patricia, part of why he didn't call a lawyer, part of why he retreated into isolation and tried to handle something alone that needed other people involved. He spent 2 weeks trying to find a way out. Then came the night that changed everything. Michael had arranged to meet Thomas at the hardware store after closing time to make one more attempt to reach some kind of agreement. He arrived to find Thomas drunk and frightened and erratic in a way that Michael had not anticipated. Thomas had apparently been spending the 2 weeks since Michael's confrontation in his own version of crisis, drinking heavily, sleeping badly, becoming increasingly convinced that Michael was going to go to the police regardless of the threat, and that Thomas's life was about to unravel anyway. Their argument escalated. Thomas became physical. He shoved Michael. Michael shoved back. And in the scuffle, Thomas fell and struck the back of his head against the edge of a metal shelving unit. The blow was severe. Thomas Green died at the scene on the floor of the hardware store within minutes. Michael Bennett stood alone in his store with a dead man on the floor and a history between them that made the death look, in the very worst possible light, like murder. He panicked, and in his panic, he made the decision that would define the next 8 years of his life. He did not call 911. He called his brother. Richard Bennett arrived at the store within 30 minutes, and it was Richard, not Michael, who took command of the situation in a way that Michael told us felt, at the time, like rescue, and which he had spent every day since recognizing as the moment his life truly went wrong. I want to be careful here about how I describe Richard, because what he did was criminal, and its consequences were severe. But I also want to be honest about the human context of it, because I think dismissing it as simply evil misses something important about how people arrive at terrible decisions. Richard loved his brother. That was real. He had watched Michael build something honest and good over 20 years, and he could not accept the idea of seeing it destroyed, whether by Thomas Green's fraud, by Michael's own past mistake, or by a system that he apparently did not trust to sort through the complexity of the situation fairly. Was that trust misplaced? Possibly. Is it understandable? I think so. Does understanding it excuse what followed? No. But I try to hold those things at the same time. Richard had told Michael that if they called the police now with a dead man on the floor and Michael's history in the background and Thomas's accusation likely to surface, Michael would almost certainly be charged with manslaughter at minimum and possibly murder. He said the town would not be forgiving. He said the business would be destroyed, the family would suffer, and there was a real possibility that the legal system, imperfect as it is, would not deliver justice in a case this complicated. What Richard proposed was this. They would make Michael disappear. Not permanently, Richard had insisted, or so Michael told us. The plan, as Richard laid it out that night, was that Michael would vanish, the business would be absorbed and sold, and after the initial chaos subsided, the story could be quietly revised. Richard said he knew a man, a former business associate named Carl Wicks, who could arrange documentation, a new identity, a place to go. He said Michael could come back in a few years once the situation had settled, once Richard had time to manage the fallout, once they had figured out a safe way to re-enter. It was not a good plan. Michael told us he knew it wasn't a good plan even at the time, but he was terrified, and Thomas Green was dead on the floor of his store, and his brother was standing in front of him offering an exit. He took it. The question you are asking right now, the question the entire town asked, the question Patricia asked with a look that could have cracked stone, was this. What happened to Thomas Green's body? And here is where the story becomes something else entirely. Thomas Green was a man with a complicated personal history of his own. He had been married twice. His first wife, Donna Parrish, lived in Georgia, and had moved on entirely from their brief and apparently unhappy marriage. His second wife, Lynn Carpenter, had similarly relocated and had no ongoing relationship with Thomas or with Harlow Creek. He had no children. He had a brother in Arizona named Norman, whom he rarely spoke to. He was, in many ways, a man who existed in Harlow Creek largely through the lens of his business relationship with Michael. What Richard did, and I want to make absolutely clear that this is the part of the case that shifted everything, that turned a desperate and self-serving act of concealment into something genuinely criminal in a completely different dimension. What Richard did was arrange for Thomas Green's body to be the thing that Michael Bennett was buried as. The man in the casket at that October funeral. The man I watched being lowered into the earth at Harlow Creek Memorial Cemetery. The man Patricia wept over, that Ethan and Claire said goodbye to, that Richard himself eulogized. That man was Thomas Green. Richard had arranged it with the assistance of two people whose roles I need to explain carefully. One was Carl Wicks. Wicks was a former associate of Richard's from his years in the construction and industrial supply business, a man who had spent several years working on the periphery of mortuary services, first as a driver for a regional funeral home and later as a contractor who handled transport and preparation for overflow situations in smaller counties. He was not a licensed mortician, but he had enough knowledge of the process and enough connections in the industry to navigate the logistics that Richard needed navigated. When Richard came to him, Wicks asked very few questions and a great many things about money. The other was Dr. Arthur Prewitt, the county medical examiner who had certified Michael Bennett's death 8 years ago. Dr. Prewitt had a gambling debt of significant and long-standing proportions. It was not a debt that was public knowledge. It involved private creditors, not casinos or legal establishments, and it had been accumulating over many years through a habit that Prewitt had managed to hide from virtually everyone in his professional and personal life. Richard had known about it for approximately 3 years prior to Michael's disappearance, through a mutual acquaintance in Millhaven who had connections to the same informal credit circles. Richard had never used that knowledge before. He used it now. The payment Richard made to Prewitt was not in cash. It was in the form of a debt cancellation arranged through the informal creditor, combined with a modest sum transferred through channels that had taken our financial investigators several weeks to trace. In exchange, Prewitt had certified the body, Thomas Green's body, transported to the scene by Wicks, after the hardware store incident, as Michael Bennett. He had conducted an abbreviated examination. He had signed the death certificate. He had cited the cause of death as acute myocardial infarction, which was not what had actually occurred. And then he had, 18 months later, retired and moved to Florida, and had presumably spent the following years hoping this day would never arrive. The family's identification of the body was the final piece. This is the element that I have thought about most, and it is the one that required the most courage from Richard to execute, because it required him to stand in a funeral home and point at Thomas Green's body and say, "Yes, that is my brother," which he did. And Ethan, who was 19 and shocked and grieving and trusting, confirmed it too in the way that a young person defers to an older authority in a moment of crisis. He saw a body that was similar in build and coloring to his father, presented to him in a setting of grief and ceremony, confirmed by his uncle and by the official process. He said yes. He grieved. Patricia did not view the body directly. She had been given medication by the family physician to manage her shock in the immediate aftermath, and the funeral home, citing her condition, had gently discouraged her from seeing the body before the casket was closed. At the time, this had seemed like kindness. Looking back, it was a piece of the engineering. I want to pause on that for a moment. I want you to sit with the specific cruelty of what Richard did to his sister-in-law, to his nephew, to his niece, the people he was supposedly protecting Michael from hurting by helping him disappear. He compounded every harm. He sent a family into grief over a man who was alive. He made Ethan confirm the death of a man who was not his father. He positioned Patricia to spend 8 years of her life as a widow who was not a widow. All of it, Richard would say in his eventual statement, was done out of love. I have spent a long time thinking about what to do with that. When the investigation that followed Michael's return became fully operational, it proceeded on 2 parallel tracks. The first was confirming Michael's identity and understanding his movements over 8 years in North Carolina. The second was reconstructing the original crime scene, the chain of custody of Thomas Green's body, and the network of complicity that had made the substitution possible. We brought in assistance from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. Detective Marcus Hale arrived from the TBI office in Nashville on the third day after Michael's appearance, and I want to say clearly that Marcus was among the most methodical and patient investigators I have ever worked alongside. He approached the case with what I can only describe as forensic stubbornness, an absolute refusal to accept any conclusion until it was supported by physical evidence independent of testimony. He started with the financial records. The payment from Richard to Prewitt had been carefully structured to avoid easy detection, but it was not invisible to someone who knew what they were looking for. Marcus traced it through 3 intermediary accounts over the course of about 11 days, ultimately confirming a specific payment made through a money management firm in Knoxville that had handled the informal debt structure. The firm's records, obtained under court order, were detailed enough to establish the transaction with certainty. Carl Wicks, the mortuary associate, had died 4 years earlier from pancreatic cancer. That was a complication because it removed one direct witness to the logistics of the substitution, but his phone records from the relevant period, obtained through a carrier subpoena, showed 2 calls to Richard's cell phone in the 48 hours following the incident at the hardware store, and a third the day before the funeral. His bank records showed a deposit of $12,000 in cash during that same week. The hardware store itself was a more difficult challenge. 8 years had passed. The building had changed ownership twice. But TBI forensic specialists examined the floor of the back storeroom, the area Michael had described as the location of the fatal fall, and found what they described as trace evidence consistent with a significant blood event that had been cleaned but not eliminated. The specific flooring material, a particular type of textured industrial tile that had been present at the time, had been partially replaced but not entirely. The remaining original tiles contained biological material in the grout lines that DNA testing ultimately confirmed as belonging to Thomas Green. That was the piece that locked it closed. Prewitt was located in a retirement community outside Orlando, Florida. He was 74 years old. When TBI investigators knocked on his door at 7 in the morning, he did not pretend to be surprised. He opened the door in his robe and said, "I've been expecting this for a long time. Come in." He cooperated immediately and fully. His detailed statement filled in the last remaining gaps in the technical picture of how the substitution had been arranged and confirmed every element that Michael and the physical evidence had established. He described, in procedural detail, exactly which steps of the standard examination he had skipped, and why those specific omissions were necessary to prevent the true identity of the body from being detected. It was a clinical account delivered in a voice that carried no self-justification, just the flat, factual tone of a man completing a very long confession. He said one thing near the end of his statement that I have never forgotten. He said, "I convinced myself that nobody was really being harmed, that a dead man is a dead man, and the name on the certificate is just paper. I knew that was wrong, but I needed to believe it. You'd be surprised what you can convince yourself of when the alternative is losing everything." I was not particularly surprised. I have been a police officer for over 20 years. Dr. Helen Pierce, who had been Prewitt's predecessor as coroner before his appointment and had since retired to a small house in eastern Tennessee, was contacted by Emily Ross, the journalist, who was running her own parallel investigation. Pierce reviewed the original case documentation and gave Ross a detailed technical assessment of the shortcuts Prewitt had taken and the standard procedures he had bypassed. When Marcus brought Pierce in for an official interview, she confirmed everything and was, as I mentioned earlier, genuinely angry. She used the phrase fundamental professional betrayal 3 times in an hour, and she meant it. The exhumation was the hardest day of the investigation for me personally. I want to be honest about that. Everything else had been a process of revelation, difficult, disorienting, but fundamentally intellectual in its moment-to-moment experience. The exhumation was not intellectual. It was standing on a hill in Harlow Creek Memorial Cemetery in the cold early morning, with the family's permission and a court order, watching a casket that had been in the ground for 8 years come back to light. I had stood at this grave 8 years ago and paid my respects. I had believed, completely and without question, what I was told about the man inside it. The formal identification process that followed the exhumation was conducted with full forensic rigor and took several days. The DNA analysis, the dental comparison, the physical characteristics all confirmed that the occupant of that grave was Thomas Green. I thought about Norman Green, Thomas's brother in Arizona. I thought about the fact that somewhere in Arizona, a man had spent 8 years not quite grieving, not quite moving on, existing in the ambiguous territory of a sibling who had simply disconnected. I thought about what it would feel like to have that ambiguity resolved in the harshest possible way. Richard Bennett was arrested on a Thursday morning, 15 days after Michael appeared at my front door. I was present for the arrest. It was carried out professionally and without incident, which is the way these things should be done. Richard came to the door of his house in Millhaven in a blue work shirt, and when I read the charges, he stood very still on his front step and looked past me toward the street with the expression of a man who has been waiting for a particular moment for a very long time and is experiencing neither surprise nor relief at its arrival. His attorney, a woman named Margaret Fossey from Millhaven, argued vigorously that Richard had acted in good faith and in the genuine belief that his brother's life and freedom were at stake. She asked the court to consider the circumstances that had led to Thomas Green's accidental death and the reasonable fear, given the appearance of the scene, that Michael would not receive a fair hearing. She argued that her client's culpability was fundamentally different from that of someone who had concealed a crime for personal financial gain. The judge heard those arguments. The sentencing reflected them to some degree, but a conviction was returned on the primary charges because the facts were what they were, and the harm caused over 8 years was real and documented and impossible to argue away. The full cast of people affected by the unraveling of this case was wide and strange and hard to predict in advance. Kevin and Rebecca Foster, Michael's old neighbors on Birchwood Lane, came forward during the investigation when we made a public appeal for anyone who recalled anything unusual around the time of Michael's supposed death. Kevin Foster was the one who had seen the unfamiliar pickup truck in the alley behind the Bennett property on the day the body was transported from the hardware store to the residence. He had mentioned it to Rebecca at the time and then never thought about it again, because at the time it was simply an unremarkable detail. When we showed him archived photographs and documents from the Wiki's files, he identified the truck. That detail tied the logistics together and confirmed the physical root of the substitution. Rebecca Foster was significant in a different way. She had been Patricia's closest friend through the 8 years of widowhood. When the truth emerged and Patricia's entire understanding of her history was rewritten in the space of a week, Rebecca was the person who showed up every day without being asked and sat with her. That kind of presence is something I have deep respect for. It asks nothing and offers everything. Ethan Bennett drove from Knoxville the day after the news broke. He walked into the station looking like a man who had been awake all night, which he had been. He was 27 years old now, and I could see Michael in him in a way that was almost difficult to look at directly. The same way of holding his head, the same slight forward lean. He sat in the conference room with Michael for almost 3 hours. Sarah and I waited outside. We could not hear the conversation, but we could observe the body language through the glass, and what I saw was two people conducting the very careful, very slow process of attempting to understand each other across a gap that had been made by choice rather than by fate. When Ethan came out, he stopped in the hallway. He said to me, quietly, "He's my father." It wasn't a question about identity. It was a statement about something more complicated than that. He walked past me and out into the parking lot and stood there for a while in the cold. Claire arrived 2 days later. She was 24 and steady in the way her mother was steady, and when she walked into that conference room and looked at her father, what I saw through the glass was not rage, not collapse, but something harder and more durable than either. She sat down across from him. She said, "I need you to know that I'm glad you're alive. And I also need you to know that I don't know if I'm going to be able to forgive you for a very long time." He nodded. She said, "I need to know that you understand those two things are both true at the same time." He said he understood. She said, "Good." And then she walked into the room and sat down. I watched that through the glass and felt something lodge in my chest that took a few days to work out of there. Susan Miller, Michael's sister, arrived in Harlow Creek 4 days after the story broke nationally. By that point, the town had become unrecognizable. Media vehicles on Main Street, people gathering outside the station, reporters calling every phone number they could find. Susan drove up from Nashville and came through the front door of the station with the particular expression of a woman who is furious and frightened in equal measure and is not going to let either show until she has the information she needs. Her meeting with Michael was the most volatile of any of the family encounters. I was outside the room for part of it, and the low, controlled intensity of her voice carried through the door, even when I couldn't make out the specific words. She said, from what Sarah told me afterward, things like, "You let us believe you were dead." She said, "Claire grew up without a father." She said, "Mother cried for 2 years, and she's been gone 4 years, and you will never be able to tell her you were alive the whole time." That last one, that's the one that hit Michael hardest, from what Sarah observed. His mother had died of natural causes 3 years after his supposed death, and she had died believing her son was gone, and there was no undoing that. Michael said afterward in one of our formal sessions that his mother's death while he was still alive and hiding was the moment when the weight of what he had done became fully real to him, that before that he had existed in a state of suspended belief, convincing himself that the situation was temporary, that Richard was managing things, that there would be a way back. His mother's death closed a door that could never be reopened. He said he had gone to the mountains on the day he heard about it and sat there for a long time and had been barely functional for the weeks that followed. The question of why he waited 4 more years to come back, even after that question is one that Michael has answered in different ways at different times, and I think the honest answer is complicated. He was afraid of prosecution. He was afraid of what his return would do to Patricia and the children. He was afraid of what he had become after 8 years of living under a false name, and whether the man who came back would bear enough resemblance to the man who had left that the return would mean anything. He was also, frankly, ashamed, the same shame that had stopped him from asking for help at the beginning. It had metastasized over 8 years into something that felt less like a feeling and more like a landscape he was permanently living inside. What finally broke through was Claire's engagement. He had been watching her public social media posts for years under a false account. He saw the photograph of her and her fiancé, a man named James Aldrich, a contractor from Knoxville who seemed, from everything Michael could observe, to be exactly the kind of person he would have hoped for his daughter. He saw her face in that photograph, and he made the decision that he had been deferring for 8 years. He came home. Emily Ross published the full account of the case 3 weeks after the initial story broke. It was extensively reported, carefully documented, and won her a state journalism award. I read it in full when it came out. There were 1 or 2 details I might have told differently, but on the whole it was accurate, and it treated all the people involved with appropriate seriousness. She asked to interview me for a follow-up piece about the investigation procedures and the changes we were making to small county death certification protocols as a result of the case. I agreed to that conversation and was glad it was being written because the procedural changes were real and they mattered. The formal legal proceedings took approximately 2 years in total. I won't walk you through every hearing and continuance, but the broad conclusions were these. Richard was convicted on the primary charges and sentenced to 4 years in a state correctional facility. Dr. Prewitt received a suspended sentence and 3 years of probation with full revocation of his medical license. Carl Wicks, having died 4 years before the investigation, was documented in the case record but could not be charged. Michael served an 8-month sentence following a determination that criminally negligent homicide charges were not supportable given the evidence, and that his other offenses, while serious, carried specific mitigating factors. Thomas Green's remains were exhumed and reinterred under his own name. His brother Norman flew in from Arizona for the ceremony. It was a quiet, brief, and appropriate farewell for a man who had been denied one for 8 years. About 3 months after Michael's release, I ran into him at Greta's diner on a Wednesday afternoon. He was sitting alone at a corner table with a cup of coffee, and he looked up when I walked in. There was a moment between us that lasted maybe 3 seconds but carried the full weight of everything that had happened. I went over. I sat down across from him without being invited. The situation seemed to require it. We talked for about an hour. He told me he was living in a small apartment on the edge of town. He was not at the house on Birchwood Lane. Patricia still lived there, and the work between them was proceeding slowly and carefully and without any certainty about where it would end up. He was seeing his children as much as they would allow, which was more than he had expected and less than he hoped for. He said Claire had come for dinner twice and that both dinners had been hard in ways that were also, underneath the hardness, something more than that. I asked him what he had been doing for 8 years in North Carolina. He said he'd been working. He'd been living quietly. He'd been building fences, literally, working for a fencing company in the mountains outside Asheville for most of those years. Managed by a man named Gary Teague who asked few questions and paid in cash for the first 2 years, until Michael had rebuilt a paper identity, credible enough to go on payroll. He said there had been long stretches of time when he'd been almost able to convince himself it was over, that the life in Harlow Creek was a previous chapter, and the new one was simply what existed now. And then something would happen. A particular slant of autumn light, the sound of a child's voice at the right pitch, the smell of sawdust, and the previous life would come rushing back, and he would have to sit with the knowledge of what he had walked away from. He said he'd tried twice to reach out to Richard over those years, to push him on the promise of a managed return. Both times, Richard had discouraged it. The first time, about 3 years in, Richard had said the time wasn't right. The second time, about 2 years later, he had said that too much had settled, that the legal and financial arrangements around the estate were too fixed to be easily unwound, and that returning would cause more harm than continuing as things were. Michael had believed him for a while, and then, gradually, he had come to understand that Richard's reasons for discouraging a return were not entirely about protecting Michael or the family. Richard had arranged things. Richard had managed the settlement of the estate, the transfer of the business, the practical logistics of a life winding down. There were elements of that process that Michael, on reflection, recognized as having served Richard's interests as much as anyone else's. Not criminally. There was no evidence that Richard had enriched himself materially from the estate beyond what was appropriate and documented, but there was something about the comfort of having a tidy resolution, the business sold, the property managed, the financial affairs settled, that had become a reason in itself to leave the situation as it was. I asked Michael what he had done when he came back to Tennessee, before he came to my door. He said he had spent 3 weeks in a motel in a town about 40 miles from Harlow Creek. He had driven past the house on Birchwood Lane twice at night just to see the lights. He had sat in his truck in the parking lot of the old hardware store building, now a different business entirely, and looked at it for a long time. He said he had gone to his mother's grave late at night and sat there for about 2 hours, and then he had driven to my house and knocked on my door. I asked him why me. Why not go directly to Patricia or to the police station? He said he thought about both of those. He said he'd come to me because I was someone who could absorb the shock professionally, who would keep him safe from a reaction that might go badly before the situation could be explained, and who he trusted, based on 12 years of quiet acquaintance, to do the right thing with what he told me. He said, I needed the first person to see me to be someone who wouldn't run or call me a ghost or slam the door. You're not the kind of man who slams the door. I sat with that for a while. Patricia Bennett did not reconcile with Michael. I want to be honest about that, rather than offer you a resolution that feels better than the reality. After everything, after the legal proceedings, after the conversations, after the careful and difficult work of understanding what had happened and why, Patricia made the decision that she and Michael would remain apart. She told a mutual friend, who told me not as gossip but as something she thought I'd want to know, that her decision was not made in anger. She said she had spent a long time with the question and had arrived at the honest conclusion that too much of what had felt real between them had been built on a version of Michael she had never fully known. She said she still cared about him. She said she was glad he was alive. She said she hoped he built something good. Claire did get married. Michael walked her down the aisle. I know this because Claire invited me to the wedding, a small outdoor ceremony in late September. And I stood in the back and watched Michael offer his daughter his arm and lead her down a path between the chairs toward the man who was waiting for her, and I thought about how small and irreducible that moment was. How all of the years and the legal proceedings and the testimony and the forensics had ultimately come down to this: a father walking beside his daughter in the autumn light. Ethan called Michael every Sunday for a while, and then every couple of weeks, and the frequency has settled into something that both of them seem to find sustainable. He told a journalist, in an interview given about a year after everything settled, that the experience had permanently changed how he thought about what you could and couldn't know about the people you loved. He said he had learned that love and honesty are not the same thing, and that the presence of one does not guarantee the other. He said he had also learned that understanding why someone did something doesn't require you to accept it as okay. He said he was still working on those ideas. He was 27 years old when he said that. He had grown up a great deal. Susan Miller has not forgiven Michael. She told him, in one of their few conversations since his return, that she may eventually. He said he would wait. I do not know whether that waiting will ever be rewarded. Some distances that open between people can be crossed. Some cannot. The people involved are usually not the ones best positioned to know which kind they're dealing with until much later. Richard Bennett served his time and was released after 3 years with good behavior credit. He and Michael have not spoken. Whether that will change is between the two of them. It is not something I am in a position to predict or particularly to have feelings about, other than the general observation that the relationship between them was irrevocably altered the night Richard proposed a solution that served his own need for control as much as his brother's need for protection. I want to tell you about what happened to the town itself, because I think it's easy to focus on the family and lose sight of the fact that a community is also a kind of organism, and this case did something to it that took a long time to settle. Harlow Creek is a town of about 7,000 people. It is not a place where major crimes happen with any regularity. The most significant cases in our recent history before this one involved a hardware theft ring in 2009 and a domestic violence situation 2 years prior that ended in a prosecution. We are, by most measures, a quiet place. People know each other. People share history. What the Bennett case did to that quiet was considerable. In the first week after Michael's appearance, the town essentially split into two camps, and the dividing line was not entirely predictable. You might expect the split to be between people who believed Michael and people who didn't, but that wasn't quite it. The identity was confirmed early enough that most people accepted fairly quickly that the man at the station was indeed Michael Bennett. The split was about what to feel about that, and it was deeper and more personal than a simple belief question. There were people, many people, who had grieved Michael, who had attended that funeral and cried genuinely and carried the weight of that loss for 8 years. For them, Michael's return was not only relief, but something that felt like a violation. Their grief had been real. It had cost them something, and now they were being told, in effect, that the object of their grief had been a lie, that they had spent 8 years processing a loss that was, in some technical sense, not real. What do you do with that? Where does it go? There were others, fewer, but vocal, who focused almost entirely on the joy of it. Michael is alive. Michael is back. The community has its member returned to it. Let's not dwell on the how and why of it. Let's be grateful for what we have. Most people, I think, held both of those reactions at the same time and found them impossible to reconcile, and that impossibility made people irritable and short-tempered in the months that followed in ways they couldn't always explain. I had conversations in those months that I remember vividly. Greta herself, who runs the diner, a woman who has been serving this community for 35 years and has very strong opinions about almost everything, told me over the counter one morning that she wasn't sure she could look Michael in the eye when he came in. She said it wasn't anger exactly. She said it felt more like the particular discomfort you feel when you realize you have been made a fool of, even by someone you like, even by someone you don't blame. Warren Peel, the contractor who had bought the hardware store business from Thomas Green years ago, found himself in the strange position of having run a business whose recent history had been built on fraud and deception, and whose previous owner was, it turned out, buried under the wrong name. He told an interviewer that he had lost 2 supplier relationships because people associated the business with the scandal, and that he had briefly considered changing the name entirely before deciding that would feel like he was admitting to something he hadn't done. James Aldrich, Claire's fiancé, distar, and later husband, handled the situation with what I can only call exceptional grace. He had known Claire's family history entirely as the story of a fatherless household, a widow's resilience, a childhood shaped by loss. When that history was suddenly and completely rewritten, he did not flinch. He met Michael before the wedding, apparently at Claire's request, and Claire told Rebecca Foster that the meeting had been awkward and genuine and that afterward both men seemed to have arrived at a quiet mutual respect. I don't know exactly what was said in that room. I'm glad I don't have to know. The staff at Bennett Building Supply, the original employees, many of whom had been with Michael for years before his supposed death, had a complicated relationship with the whole affair. A few of them had still been working there when Thomas Green ran it. A few remembered Michael with genuine warmth and felt, at the news of his return, something like vindication, as though the rightness of their memory of him had been confirmed. One of them, a woman named Harriet Graves, who had been Michael's office manager for 12 years, sent him a card that said simply, "I knew there was something wrong. I could never say what." Michael kept that card. The reverend who had presided over Michael's funeral, a man named Reverend David Sohm, who was still at First Baptist, gave a sermon about 3 weeks after the story broke that I heard described by several people as one of the finest he had ever delivered. I wasn't there, but Rebecca Foster told me about it. She said he spoke about the difference between truth and certainty, about how a community can be certain of something and still be completely wrong, and about what it means to grieve a loss and then be asked to revise that grief without erasing its reality. She said half the congregation cried. She said the other half sat very still in their seats with the particular expression of people processing something that doesn't fit any category they already possess. She interviewed Norman Green for it, which I thought was the right thing to do. Norman's voice had been largely absent from the original coverage, which had focused naturally on the Bennett family's story. His account of having a brother who simply disappeared, and of living with that disappearance for 8 years in a state of low-grade unresolved grief, was the most quietly devastating part of the follow-up piece. He said in the interview that he had sent Michael a letter. He said the letter told Michael that he forgave him, and that his forgiveness was for his own sake, not Michael's, and that he hoped Michael would spend the rest of his life doing something that made it worth forgiving. That is the sentence from this entire case that I return to the most often. I still live in Harlow Creek. I still drive the same roads I've driven for 20 years. I pass the old hardware store building, different business now, a tile and flooring shop, and I pass the cemetery on the hill, and sometimes I glance up at it and think about all the layers of story that accumulate in a place over time, the visible and the hidden, the official and the true, the things we buried and the things we believed we buried. The procedural changes that came out of this case were real. Double sign-off requirements on death certificates. Mandatory fingerprint comparison for all unwitnessed deaths in county jurisdictions. Standardized protocols for cases where visual identification is the primary means of confirming identity. None of these changes are dramatic, none of them will make headlines, but they will catch the next Arthur Prewitt before he signs something he shouldn't. That matters. I have thought a great deal in the time since all of this concluded about what it means to be wrong in the most complete way a person can be wrong about something. I stood at a graveside and said goodbye to a man who was alive. I watched a widow grieve a husband who was living. I accepted a death certificate signed by a man who was being paid to lie. And not a single step of that process felt like anything other than what it was supposed to be. That is the hardest lesson. Not the obvious one. Not the lesson about corruption or family loyalty or the desperation that drives people to terrible choices. The hardest lesson is the one about certainty, about how much of what we call knowledge is actually trust. We trusted the death certificate. We trusted the coroner. We trusted the coffin and the burial and the grief we witnessed. All of that trust was extended in good faith, and all of it was exploited. I have heard it said that experience makes you harder to fool. I used to believe that. I believe it less now. Experience makes you faster at reading certain patterns, but it also makes you comfortable with patterns. And comfort is exactly what a skilled deception is designed to exploit. The last time I spoke with Michael was about 6 months ago. I was at the diner again. I seemed to have a lot of important conversations at Greta's. And he came in and saw me and sat down across from me and ordered coffee, and we talked for about 40 minutes about nothing in particular. How Claire was doing, how the weather had been, whether the new road construction on Route 12 was going to be finished before summer. Ordinary things. At the end, he stood up and put his hand out and I shook it. He said, "Thank you, Cedric, for opening the door that night." I said, "I almost didn't." He smiled at that. A real smile, the first one I'd seen from him that carried some lightness in it. He said, "I know, I almost didn't knock." And then he walked to his truck, an old pickup, battered and reliable looking, not unlike the one he used to drive, and got in and drove away. I stood on the sidewalk outside Greta's for a while after that, thinking about what it means to bury someone, what it means to grieve someone, what it means to have the bedrock of what you understood about a moment in time shift beneath your feet so fundamentally that you have to go back and reinterpret 8 years of your own memory. Michael Bennett came back because his daughter was getting married and he couldn't watch from the dark any longer. That impulse, that particular specific human need to be known by the people you love, was the thing that undid 8 years of carefully constructed deception. Not a forensic breakthrough, not a lucky witness, not a tip to a journalist, a father who couldn't let his daughter walk into her future without him. I think about that more than anything else from this case. I think about how the most elaborate deceptions in the world can be brought down not by brilliant detective work or forensic breakthroughs, but by something much simpler and much harder to plan against.
The need to be present for the people you love. The need to be real to them. The need, at the end of everything, to stand in the light.
Nobody plans for that when they're building a deception. Nobody accounts for it. And maybe that's the one thing in 20 plus years of this work that still gives me something close to hope. That's all I've got. Thanks for listening, everyone. Stay safe.